The story begins with the hero being defeated by the Demon King. Humanity, cornered, gathered 1,000 barrier mages to counter the Demon King and his army. They created a barrier against the demon realm, and during that time, generations of heroes challenged the Demon King, but they kept losing. 30 years later, in the mountains, our protagonist Blake, a 39-year-old barrier mage, woke up and stretched his hands. After putting on a coat, he stepped out of his hut and remarked to himself that he still felt energetic today. He looked at the swarm of demons outside the barrier he had created. He noticed that the barrier was getting weaker. Kneeling down, he placed both hands on the ground and began to cast a spell to reinforce the barrier. He poured all his energy into thickening it, but observed that the barrier's effectiveness had been weakening faster lately, and the required magical power had increased significantly. Blake hoped that a new hero would soon defeat the Demon King. Meanwhile, in the Demon King's castle, the hero faced the Demon King. They dashed toward each other and launched their attacks simultaneously. The hero screamed loudly while swinging her sword. Along with her attack, she unleashed her power and managed to slash the Demon King while dodging his attack. The Demon King was severely injured, coughing up blood, and could not believe he had lost. He repeatedly muttered that it was unforgivable and tried to say something to the hero, but he died before he could finish. The hero smiled victoriously, raised her sword, and declared their triumph, urging everyone to celebrate. A strong blue light emerged from the Demon King's castle, which Blake noticed. He was shocked and wondered what it was. He then saw the demons outside the barrier collapse and slowly vanish. Blake guessed that the heroes had defeated the Demon King. He also noticed the miasma disappearing and was amazed, realizing that it was true. Blake was glad that the miasma and monsters from the demon realm were vanishing, bringing peace to the world. Knowing that everyone could now live without worry, he reflected on maintaining the barrier for 30 years and wondered if there would be some reward. 1 month later, men appeared at his hut. One of them shouted that he was no longer needed. Confused, Blake asked what they meant. The man accused him of wasting public funds on a useless barrier and called him a money-grubbing fraud. Blake explained that he had been maintaining the barrier to prevent miasma and monsters from escaping the demon realm, but the man pretended not to know anything about it and mocked him, asking what an incompetent, bottom-tier barrier mage could possibly do. Another man kicked Blake out of his hut, shouting that the shabby hut and land belonged to the country. Feeling hopeless, Blake walked away, saddened that his 30 years of hard work had come to this. He decided he had no choice but to return to the village where he had lived as a child. A short time later, Blake arrived at the Adventurers Guild in Hatno Village and was surprised to see a few gold coins on the table. He told the guild receptionist that the reward was too small, but the old lady grew angry and shouted at him not to complain. Blake knew he couldn't survive on such a small amount and felt disheartened, wondering if the barrier had really been useless after all. The next day, Blake was forced to work at the guild despite the low pay, as he had no other job options as a barrier mage. He begged the receptionist for work, telling her he didn't mind if the pay was low. However, the old lady replied that there was no work left for him, because no one requested barrier mages anymore. The man behind him teased that he should try weeding or other odd jobs, but another man mockingly added that even those jobs wouldn't need a barrier mage. They laughed at him as Blake stood there, dejected. Blake remained silent while the men laughed at him. But suddenly someone knocked on the guild door. A knight barged inside and asked if there was a barrier mage named Blake present. The receptionist was shocked to see royal knights, and the men questioned why they were in such a rural area, speculating if the incompetent barrier mage had done something wrong. Blake immediately raised his hand and told the captain that he was the barrier mage, Blake. The captain stared at him for a moment while approaching, making Blake uneasy. The knight then informed him that they had come on Hero Alice's orders and were heading to the royal capital, asking if Blake would be willing to accompany them. The men who had been mocking Blake were stunned upon hearing that he was summoned by the hero and invited to the royal capital. They questioned how an incompetent barrier mage could achieve such recognition. Blake replied to the captain that he understood, and the captain apologized for the urgency, explaining that they needed to depart immediately. Pointing to the carriage outside, the captain instructed Blake to board it. As Blake approached the carriage, the men began panicking, asking the old receptionist if Blake really was just a barrier mage, worried they might face punishment for their behavior. The old woman stuttered, suggesting they should apologize. Once Blake entered the carriage, their journey began. He found the ride surprisingly comfortable but felt out of place, unable to believe he had been summoned by the hero. He recalled helping her once before and wondered if she remembered him. Hours later, they arrived at the Hendira Kingdom's royal capital, Miston. Looking out the window, Blake marveled at the sheer size of the city, having never seen so many people before. The carriage rode straight to the castle. Upon arrival, he followed the knight captain inside, feeling increasingly out of place. Suddenly, a sweet voice greeted him, saying, "You've come," and he turned to see Hero Alice, an 18-year-old with a warm smile. She told him she had been waiting for him and asked if he remembered her. When Blake replied that he did, she became excited, expressing how glad she was. Alice thanked Blake for saving her when she was separated from her companions near the demon realm. She explained that she had thought it was the end for her until he helped her. Blake awkwardly replied that he didn't do much, and had simply assisted her companions as well. Alice apologized that her companions couldn't meet him as they were busy with ceremonies, then excitedly asked about his plans now that his barrier work was finished, speculating that someone like him must be in high demand. Blake laughed awkwardly, admitting that nothing was decided yet, though the truth was that he was unemployed. Alice, beaming with enthusiasm, suggested he join the Royal Magician Corps, shocking everyone and angering one of the members. Gunther, the 22-year-old vice captain of the 5th Division of the Royal Magician Corps, protested. He explained that the Royal Magician Corps was an elite unit, and barrier mages were unqualified to join. He told Alice not to lump incompetent barrier mages together with magicians. Alice defended Blake, reminding Gunther that barrier mages had maintained the barrier that suppressed miasma and monsters from the demon realm. Gunther dismissed her argument, arrogantly claiming that monsters feared magicians, not barriers, and that miasma could easily be dealt with using magic. He concluded that barrier mages were unnecessary. Blake silently clenched his fists in anger, recalling how barrier mages had been respected 30 years ago. He couldn't believe their reputation had fallen so much in that time. Gunther mockingly called Blake an old man and suggested that only young, promising individuals were suited for such jobs. He then told Alice that Blake had no skills and shouldn't be considered unless he could prove otherwise. Alice asked Gunther if he was saying Blake should prove himself by defeating him. Gunther confidently replied that if Blake had enough skill to beat him, then it would be fine. Alice told Blake that she believed he could win, boosting his confidence. Blake hesitated but ultimately agreed. Shortly after, they stood on an outdoor stage. Blake faced Gunther, who wore a mocking smile. Blake wondered how things had escalated to this when he had only come because he was summoned. Gunther introduced himself as the vice captain of the 5th Division of the Royal Magicians. He began gathering fire magic in his hand, warning Blake not to complain if he died. Gunther then aimed and unleashed the fireball directly at Blake. Gunther's attack caused a strong explosion, and the magicians assumed it was over, praising their vice captain's power. Gunther arrogantly laughed, saying this was what happened when a mere barrier mage got cocky. However, his laughter was interrupted, making him irritated. He demanded to know who was disrupting his moment of victory, only to hear a voice ask, "Has the exam started yet?" Gunther and everyone else were shocked to see Blake standing unscathed. Gunther stared in disbelief, wondering how it was possible since he had cast the spell with the intent to burn him to ashes. He couldn't fathom what Blake had done. Frustrated, Gunther cast another fire spell, declaring that he had gone too easy on him and would now get serious. Mockingly, he shouted for Blake to just take it as he released a stronger fire magic attack. Blake calmly raised a barrier, protecting himself once more. Gunther's attack exploded upon impact, but he didn't stop, hurling a swarm of fireballs at Blake while shouting for him to burn to ashes. The young magicians watching grew worried, thinking that no one could survive such magic. However, Blake, who was effortlessly blocking the attacks with his barrier, found the magic too weak. He wondered if Gunther was still holding back because the power didn't add up. After an onslaught of attacks, Gunther covered his nose from the smoke and smugly asked if Blake was finally dead. But as the smoke cleared, he froze and shocked Blake was still standing in the same spot without a scratch. Gunther shouted in disbelief, demanding to know how Blake was still alive. Blake turned to face Gunther, who was muttering to himself that this was impossible. Gunther, in a mocking tone, taunted Blake, calling him trash who could only create barriers. He sneered that defending was meaningless if Blake couldn't attack, urging him to try striking back if he was so frustrated. Blake, confused for a moment, raised his hand and calmly said he would do just that. Gunther, equally confused, asked what Blake had just said. Suddenly, a small but powerful barrier shot from Blake's hand, slamming into Gunther's face. The force sent Gunther rolling across the ground until he crashed into a wall. The magicians gasped in disbelief that their vice captain had been blown away. Gunther stood up, cursing, and demanded to know what Blake had done, insisting that barrier mages couldn't attack. Blake simply replied that he had moved the barrier and demonstrated the technique. Gunther shouted in outrage, claiming that barriers were meant to be stationary and moving them made no sense. Blake awkwardly explained that after 30 years of setting up barriers, he had gotten the hang of it, jokingly asking if it counted as cheating. The magicians began whispering among themselves, questioning if the barrier mage was actually stronger than the vice captain. They noted that Blake had taken all the attacks without a single scratch. Hearing their whispers, Gunther grew enraged, wondering how he could lose to Trash. Realizing his position was slipping, he glanced at his team, who silently nodded back at him. They cast a spell to create a small fireball behind Blake. The fireball grew larger and attempted to burn him from behind, but Blake's shield activated automatically, protecting him. The crowd was stunned, but Alice smiled knowingly. Blake, oblivious, turned and asked if something had hit him, wondering if it was a stone. Gunther, watching in disbelief, realized the barrier activated on its own. "What the hell is this guy?" he muttered. Alice stared at Blake, a glimmer of pride in her eyes, thinking that Blake had proven his strength. Furious, Gunther prepared another spell. He couldn't accept ending the duel in such humiliation. Pouring all his mana into a final attack, He prepared to release an advanced fire magic spell. The young magicians, sensing the danger, fled, knowing they would be caught in the blast. Gunther shouted at Blake, declaring that he would kill him with this full power attack, and unleashed a massive fire cannonball. Blake didn't even move as the enormous spell barreled toward him. The magicians behind him screamed in fear, but Alice remained calm. She knew advanced magic couldn't be blocked by an ordinary barrier, but she believed in Blake, as one time when they surrounded by demon, he had killed demons by simply moving his barriers. As she expected, Blake effortlessly nullified the fire cannonball, leaving Gunther in stunned disbelief. Gunther fell to his knees, repeatedly muttering that it was impossible. His strongest magic had failed, and his mana was completely depleted. The crowd murmured in awe, realizing that Blake had won. Alice proudly announced that Blake had proven himself and declared that the Barrier Mage squad had triumphed. She insisted Blake was qualified to join the Royal Magician Corps. Gunther tried to argue, shouting that Blake wasn't the only Barrier Mage. He demanded to know what had happened to the others. Investigators arrived, reporting that most of the other Barrier Mages had either died or abandoned their duties, embezzling funds in the process. Gradually, they had disappeared, leaving Blake as the sole Barrier Mage maintaining the vast barrier around the demon realm. Blake understood, realizing why his mana for setting up barriers kept increasing. Gunther, stunned, shouted at the investigator, questioning how Blake alone could manage a barrier over an area larger than the entire kingdom of Hendria. He pressed further, asking the investigator if his saying Blake maintaining a barrier that scaled by himself. Alice smiled, realizing Blake had exceeded all expectations. Suddenly, a voice interrupted the commotion. A figure entered the scene, demanding to know what was going on. Gunther froze in shock. It was Lancelot, the captain of the 1st Division. Everyone was amazed to see Lancelot, the top captain of the 1st Division, as it was their first time seeing him up close. Lancelot ordered Gunther to explain what was going on. Before Gunther could respond, Alice appeared next to Lancelot and explained that she had recommended Blake, the Barrier Mage, to join the Royal Magician Corps. However, Gunther had doubted Blake's abilities, leading to a practical test. Lancelot asked Alice to confirm if this meant they had conducted a duel, and she replied affirmatively. Gunther angrily glared at Blake, but Blake remained calm. Lancelot then turned to Gunther and remarked that it appeared he had lost. Gunther, flustered, tried to excuse himself by claiming he had gone easy on Blake, insisting it wouldn't have been appropriate to go all out against a mere barrier mage. Lancelot firmly cut him off, stating that he had heard enough of his pathetic excuses. Gunther's frustration was evident, but he didn't dare talk back in fear of Lancelot's authority. Lancelot approached Blake and said that regardless of one's title, if they had the skills, they would be allowed to join. He officially declared Blake a member of the Royal Magician Corps, much to Blake's surprise. The other magicians were equally stunned that Lancelot was allowing a barrier mage into the elite corps, but having witnessed Blake defeat the 5th Division vice captain, they had no objections. Blake smiled in disbelief, wondering if someone like him, who had spent 30 years maintaining barriers, could truly belong in the kingdom's top magician corps. Alice then stepped forward, smiling brightly, and congratulated him. She sweetly told him that she had always believed in him. Blake thanked her, saying it was all thanks to her. Alice brushed it off, suggesting they go out to celebrate instead. Before they could leave, Lancelot appeared behind Alice and sternly asked if she thought she had time for celebrations. Alice sighed in frustration as the magicians grabbed her, and Lancelot reminded her that they needed to get back to work. She resisted, calling out to Blake for help, but they dragged her away despite her protests. Afterward, Lancelot turned to Blake and remarked that Alice seemed to favor him. He asked what kind of relationship Blake had with her. Blake calmly replied that they were merely acquaintances. Lancelot nodded but warned him that many people tried to get close to the hero for ulterior motives, cautioning Blake not to be one of them. With that, Lancelot walked away, while Gunther glared at Blake with pure hatred. A few days later, Blake arrived at the Royal Magician Corps dormitory. He was surprised by the size and grandeur of the building. Upon entering, he looked around nervously, searching for his assigned room. As he wandered, a group of young women noticed him and began whispering among themselves. They wondered why an older man was in the dormitory, noting that he didn't look like a superior officer. His shabby clothes made them suspect he was a commoner. Feeling awkward under their stares, Blake quickly walked away, deciding to find his room as soon as possible. After a few minutes, he located room 206, the room assigned to him. He knocked on the door and opened it, excusing himself as he entered. Inside, a young trainee of the Royal Magician Corps, 16-year-old Sven, turned to face him and asked bluntly, "Who are you?" Blake greeted Sven and introduced himself as his new roommate, starting today. Sven immediately asked, "Why is there an old guy here?" After Blake explained everything, Sven shouted in disbelief, asking if Blake was claiming that he had been recommended by the hero and had defeated Vice Captain Gunther to join the Royal Magician Corps. Sven then shouted at him not to lie, prompting Blake to realize that, from an objective perspective, it did sound unbelievable. Sven began shaking, making Blake worriedly ask if he was alright. Sven then shouted that his life in the Corps was over because an old liar guy was on the same team as him. Confused, Blake asked what he meant by same team. Sven explained that roommates were placed on the same team in the new trainee division. Blake nodded in understanding and apologized for being an old man, but assured Sven that he would do his best not to hold him back. Feeling guilty, Sven stuttered that it wasn't entirely Blake's fault. Sven suddenly stopped and noticed Blake's hair, commenting that it was a mess and would get in the way during training. He asked if Blake wanted him to cut it for him. Minutes later, Sven finished cutting Blake's hair and asked how it was. Blake thanked him, saying he felt refreshed. Suddenly, Sven snapped, realizing it was almost time for training. He hurriedly told Blake to change into his uniform, to which Blake quickly agreed. A moment later, they met Therese and Clara, two 16-year-old trainees of the Royal Magician Corps. Therese asked Sven who the old guy was, and Clara mentioned that she had never seen him before. Sven replied that Blake was apparently on their team, and Blake greeted them. Therese was shocked and shouted, asking why an old man was on their team and if it wasn't strange to have him as a new recruit. Clara tried to calm her down, saying she was going too far, but Therese retorted that Clara was probably thinking the same thing. Blake heard their comments but remained calm, acknowledging that all the other recruits were young and that he was the only older person there. Shortly after, a senior officer introduced Blake to the group, announcing that he had just joined. Blake introduced himself as a barrier mage and greeted everyone. The other trainees began whispering, speculating if he was the one rumored to have defeated Vice Captain Gunther. Most doubted the story, thinking there was no way it could be true. Clara and Therese were skeptical, struggling to believe it, while Sven panicked, thinking their team was doomed because Blake was a barrier mage and therefore, in his opinion, weak. From the side, Gunther glared at Blake with hatred, vowing silently that Blake wouldn't get away with embarrassing him. The senior addressed the group, explaining that they were the newest recruits and their divisions hadn't been decided yet. Their performance during training would determine their placements. Blake realized this meant they weren't officially enlisted yet and resolved to work hard and show results. The senior then announced that for their first task, they would conduct a survival exercise. The trainees were instructed to hunt monsters in the Mecha Forest, with points awarded based on their performance. They had 2 weeks to complete the exercise. The announcement caused panic among the trainees, as they all knew that the Mecha Forest was infamous for its miasma pools. The senior, seemingly unconcerned, remarked that it was just bad luck for them and ordered everyone to grab their equipment and depart. Blake picked up his gear while Sven, terrified, kept muttering that it was over, knowing that the Mecha Forest was no place for rookies. Sven then turned to Blake, begging him not to hold the team back. Blake calmly reassured him that he understood. The senior ordered everyone to board dragon carriages by team, as they would be transported to their respective starting points in the forest. Everyone climbed into their carriages, unaware that Gunther was secretly plotting to make Blake's life hell during the exercise. After hours of traveling, they arrived at the forest. Sven was stunned with horror when he saw the place and shouted, asking what kind of hellish place it was. Sven asked why they had started from a mountaintop far from the forest. Clara observed that it seemed there were no other teams nearby, prompting Therese to ask if they had drawn the short straw. Sven shouted in despair that it was over, and that they were totally screwed. He added that he had dreamed of joining the Royal Magician Corps, but this was what he got instead. Therese snapped at Sven, calling him pathetic and reminding him that, as the team leader, he should at least say, "Follow me," or something encouraging. Sven angrily shouted back for her to shut up, complaining that he had only been appointed team leader out of nowhere. Blake excused himself from their argument, causing Sven and Therese to turn to him in irritation and ask what he wanted. Blake calmly suggested that they look at the map and figure out where they were. He added that he'd like to know their exact location. Sven and Therese exchanged silent glances before Sven reluctantly opened the map. He pointed out their current position. Clara commented that it was quite far from their target, but they might make it if they hurried. Therese, however, questioned if it was even possible unless they rushed the whole way. Blake asked if they should leave immediately, and Sven begrudgingly agreed, saying they had no choice. Therese sighed in frustration but told the group to steel themselves for the journey. They began descending the mountaintop and continued walking for hours. Sven grumbled that the luggage was too heavy, making it difficult to walk. Therese, visibly tired, stuttered while asking if they were still not at Mecha Forest yet. Clara glanced at Blake and noticed that, unlike the rest of them, the older man wasn't even breaking a sweat. She silently wondered if Blake was used to such strenuous travel. Hours passed, and night had fallen by the time they arrived at Mecha Forest. Sven immediately noticed the intense miasma in the air, and Therese agreed, noting that a normal person without resistance would die instantly upon entering. Clara reassured them that as magicians, they should be fine with that level of miasma. Therese then asked Sven to confirm their target, a level 2 Komodo dragon. Sven agreed and pointed out that the location of its nest was marked on the map. Blake, curious, asked what the level system referred to, shocking Sven that he didn't know. Sven explained that monsters were classified into 10 levels of strength, with level 1 being the weakest and level 10 the strongest. Blake thanked Sven for the information, and Sven proudly replied, not to mention it. But before Sven could bask in his explanation, Therese and Clara began walking ahead. Therese called back to them, asking what they were doing and reminding them that they needed to keep moving. Sven, startled, shouted for them not to leave him behind as he scrambled to catch up. An hour passed as they continued their trek through the forest. Suddenly, rustling came from a nearby bush. The group turned to see goblins hiding within. Sven, recognizing them as level 1 monsters, quickly cast a fire spell and threw it at one of the goblins, boasting that he could handle them alone. His attack hit one goblin, but the 2 remaining goblins leaped at him simultaneously, making him panic. Before the goblins could reach Sven, a surge of strong magical power sliced through them, reducing them to pieces. It was Therese who scolded Sven, reminding him never to let his guard down. Sven sat down, holding his slightly injured arm, and grumbled to Therese that she didn't need to interfere. Clara, noticing his injury, healed him. Sven thanked her and apologized. Blake, observing from a short distance, stayed quiet. Sven turned to him, frustrated, and asked why he didn't help. Before Blake could reply, Therese reminded Sven that he had insisted he could handle it alone. Sven shouted at her to shut up but reluctantly agreed, turning to Blake to apologize. A short while later, as they continued walking, a monster appeared above Sven, ready to attack him. Blake, noticing it, stumbled intentionally, making it seem like an accident. Sven, unaware of the monster, dodged it without realizing the danger. Concerned, he asked Blake if he was all right, and Therese questioned what he was doing. Blake apologized, placing his hand on the ground as though steadying himself, but in reality, casting a spell. He told them he had found a path when he fell and suggested they head that way, pointing to a more open area. Sven agreed, noticing the clearer route, and the group proceeded in that direction. Therese called for Clara, who replied that she was coming. Unbeknownst to them, Blake quietly eliminated monsters behind them using his magic. Clara briefly sensed the power and turned to look but saw nothing unusual. A moment later, Blake mentioned hearing the sound of water nearby and pointed ahead. When they arrived near a lake, the group took a moment to rest. Noticing monsters lurking nearby, Blake suggested they start moving again. After hours of travel, night fell, and the group decided to rest. The young magician slept while Blake took watch. As he stood guard, a massive beast crept toward them and growled before attempting to bite him. Blake's barrier automatically activated, blocking the attack and sending the beast away in pain. Sven, startled by the sound, woke up and asked if Blake had heard something. Blake calmly replied that he hadn't heard anything unusual. Sven offered to take over the watch, but Blake reassured him that he was fine and would wake him if needed. Sven thanked him and went back to sleep, unaware that Blake's barrier was silently protecting the entire area. The next day, as they resumed their journey, Sven noticed the surprising lack of monster encounters and commented that it was unsettling how smoothly things were going, even though the trek remained challenging. Clara observed Blake from the corner of her eye, thinking it was strange that they had only faced weak monsters so far. She recalled the rumors about Blake defeating Vice Captain Gunther and wondered if Blake was somehow influencing their situation. Therese interjected, pointing out that the lack of strong monsters was a good thing. She remarked that they were already exhausted from all the walking, and encountering powerful monsters would be disastrous. She urged the group to hurry toward the Komodo dragon's nest. Meanwhile, in the Hendira kingdom, Gunther smirked to himself, convinced that Blake and his team were as good as dead. He had ensured they were sent to the most dangerous location. Even if they managed to reach Mecha Forest, the route was infested with monsters. And should they somehow arrive at the target destination, they wouldn't find a Komodo dragon but a level 4 salamander instead. As the group reached their supposed target, they froze in terror upon seeing the salamander. The youngest magicians panicked, and they shouted that salamanders were monsters capable of burning down entire villages with a single breath. She declared that they needed to run immediately. However, before they could act, another salamander appeared behind them, trapping the group. Sven dropped to his knees, trembling and stuttering that it was over, convinced they couldn't win. Therese and Clara were silent, shaking in fear. The first salamander began gathering fire in its mouth and released a blazing breath toward them. The group screamed in terror. Therese, tears streaming down her face, opened her eyes, confused to find that it wasn't hot. Unbeknownst to them, Blake stood calmly, shielding them from the deadly flames with his barrier. The group was stunned as they saw the barrier blocking the flames. Clara asked in disbelief if it was Blake's doing. The salamander unleashed an even stronger torrent of fire, causing Sven to scream in panic, shouting that it was impossible to escape even with the barrier. Blake slowly walked out of the barrier, surprising everyone. Smiling, he told them to stay put and wait. Sven, alarmed, asked what he meant by that and called out to him, but Blake continued walking forward. Sven shouted desperately, asking if Blake was planning to act as a decoy. He insisted there was no way a barrier mage could defeat a salamander. The race, trying to remain composed, told them that Blake's sacrifice couldn't be in vain and instructed the team to escape through the weakest part of the flames the moment the barrier disappeared. Sven angrily protested, shouting that they couldn't just abandon the old man. Therese retorted that there was no way they could defeat a salamander. Clara, watching from within the barrier, noticed that the flames outside were beginning to weaken. The team stared in confusion, wondering what was happening. Then they saw Blake rushing toward the salamander, and with a sharp-edged barrier, slicing its head off in a single swing. The salamander's body collapsed, its severed head crashing to the ground. The group froze in stunned silence, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Blake had defeated the salamander in an instant. Blake noticed the second salamander to his side gathering an immense amount of fire in its mouth. It unleashed a blazing attack at him, but he managed to jump out of the way. Using his barriers as makeshift shields, he remained in the air. The salamander tilted its head, aiming to attack again, but Blake skillfully avoided the fireballs by creating a ladder of shield tiles in midair. As he reached the salamander, Blake cast a crystallized barrier, wrapping it around his fist. He launched his fist toward the salamander, striking its head with tremendous force. The impact slammed the salamander into the ground, shattering the earth beneath it. With the salamander defeated, Blake deactivated his shields and landed safely. Calmly picking up his equipment, he remarked, "That's the end of it." Reflecting on the encounter, he recalled having fought many similar lizards in the dense forest near the demon realm. He speculated that these salamanders, though said to be level 4, were probably just weaker individuals. The young magicians, still in shock, rushed to him, shouting in awe. They bombarded him with questions. How was he so strong? Was it a barrier technique? How could barriers traditionally used for defense be used to attack? Blake, perplexed by their astonishment, replied modestly, saying he didn't think of himself as strong. He explained that he had occasionally hunted monsters while maintaining the barrier in the demon realm, which seemed to downplay his abilities in their eyes. Clara, however, couldn't believe what she had seen. Blake hadn't just used his barriers for defense or attack, he had also used them as a foothold to maneuver midair. She began to wonder if barrier techniques were far more versatile and powerful than she had imagined. Quietly, she concluded that Blake might not be just an ordinary old man. Days later, back at the dormitory stage, Gunther was laughing to himself, confident that Blake must be dead. He smugly thought of how he had ensured Blake's demise by assigning him and his team to treacherous mountain paths, hordes of monsters, and the salamander's nest. The senior officer arrived at the stage, waiting to greet returning teams. As one team returned, the senior praised them for doing excellent work. Gunther, watching from the sidelines, scoffed, believing it was impossible for Blake's team to survive. However, the senior announced that Team F had returned first. Gunther froze in shock, unable to process what he had just heard. How could they still be alive? And not only alive, they were the first team to return. Gunther tried to calm himself, reasoning that they must have fled back without completing the task and likely hadn't brought any monster materials with them. The senior officer shouted in disbelief, causing Gunther to smirk, thinking his assumptions were correct. However, the senior then exclaimed his surprise at seeing a salamander's fang among the materials the team had brought back. He declared that it was a top-level result in their training history. Gunther began to sweat, unable to believe that a group of so-called dropouts and a barrier mage had managed to defeat a salamander. The senior praised the team for their outstanding performance and announced that their success would significantly boost their scores. He encouraged them to keep up the good work in future training. The team cheered, thrilled by their achievement. The senior then turned to his co-senior and asked if there was a salamander's nest on the training route. The so-senior, puzzled, replied that the preliminary survey had only identified low-level monsters in the area. Meanwhile, Sven proudly proclaimed that he couldn't believe they were at the top of the leaderboard. Others reminded him that most of the credit belonged to Blake, as he had defeated the salamander and guided them safely back. Clara agreed, noting that they couldn't have accomplished it without him. Sven approached Blake shyly and thanked him. Blake modestly replied that it wasn't true, insisting that they had overcome obstacles because everyone had worked hard and all he had done was lend a little help. Sven was visibly moved by Blake's humility. Thurs smiled and told Blake that she would choose to believe him anyway. Sven added that Blake was a good guy, and Clara also thanked him. However, Blake couldn't shake the feeling that they had been at a significant disadvantage compared to other teams and suspected that their success might not have been entirely coincidental. While the group chatted and celebrated, Gunther stood nearby, shaking with rage and glaring at Blake. His mind swirled with thoughts of revenge, vowing that he wouldn't let it slide. A few days later, the trainees gathered for another session. The instructor announced that today's training would take the form of a competition, and the teams were to split up accordingly. Sven remarked that the main training ground seemed cramped, and Thurs suggested moving to the less crowded second training ground. Clara agreed, and the group headed off in that direction. Gunther noticed them leaving and smiled as a devious plan began forming in his mind. At the second training ground, Sven suggested testing Blake's abilities, but Blake jokingly told him to take it easy on him. Suddenly, Gunther appeared and ordered them to wait. Gunther added that since they were using the second training ground, he would instruct them personally. Sven whispered to the race, asking why Vice Captain Gunther was participating in their training. Thurs replied that she had heard he was helping out due to a shortage of instructors. Gunther noticed their whispers and shouted at them, demanding to know what they were talking about before ordering them to gather immediately. The group reluctantly replied, "Yes, sir." Gunther then turned to Blake and sneered, telling him that he wasn't needed and should just stand there like an idiot and watch. Gunther faced the trainees and began their instruction. Moments later, Therese was lying on the ground, covered in injuries. Clara rushed to her side and healed her wounds. Gunther teased them, asking why they weren't taking the exercise seriously, and pointing out that if their opponent were a real monster, they would already be dead. Gunther shouted at them to get up, declaring that the instruction wasn't over yet. Blake tried to approach the injured trainees, but Gunther barked at him to stay put, reminding him that he had been ordered not to move. Gunther mockingly explained that he was only instructing the trainees because they were weak. Blake glared at Gunther in anger, but Gunther merely smirked, pleased to see the frustration on Blake's face. It was exactly what he wanted to make Blake feel powerless. Gunther turned back to the trainees, demanding they stop dawdling and get into position. Gathering fire magic in his hands, he aimed it at the group. "If you can't get into position," he shouted, "I'll make you." Gunther released a torrent of fire toward the terrified trainees, who screamed in fear. Gunther's attack exploded, but he teasingly told Blake that it seemed his comrades had gotten into quite a predicament and that his hand had slipped because Blake had insulted him. Gunther then faced Blake and told him not to misunderstand it was just guidance, and he hadn't killed them. However, he admitted he might have gotten a bit too passionate with the guidance, so they were probably a bit singed. Gunther proudly pointed at the new trainees, telling Blake that the smoke was starting to clear and that he should behold the miserable state of his comrades. But when the smoke disappeared, the trainees were safe, thanks to a shield. This shocked Gunther, who asked why they were unharmed. Sven looked at his body, wondering if it was a barrier, and if the old man had created it. Gunther glanced at Blake, wondering if he had done something, but noticed that Blake hadn't moved. Meanwhile, the instructors noticed the situation between Gunther and Team F. They also saw that the trainees looked pretty beaten up and asked what had happened. Gunther explained that he was giving them guidance, but it seemed the trainees had reached their limit, and he was just about to wrap things up. However, Sven shouted that it wasn't guidance but bullying, and Therese angrily added that she was furious Gunther had planned to end it like that. Blake observed them, and Clara firmly said that she wanted to win with everyone's power. The three trainees confidently looked at Blake, and he nodded in response. They all then told Gunther that they could still keep going, urging him to continue the guidance and promising they wouldn't lose. The instructors were touched by their determination and encouraged them to hang in there and not lose to the vice captain. Gunther, annoyed but unable to back out without losing face, agreed. The trainees encouraged each other to work together and win. Gunther unleashed his fire magic, telling them there was no way they could beat him. He attacked with a huge fireball, but they didn't even flinch, remaining unharmed thanks to Blake's shield. Sven teasingly told Gunther that his magic wouldn't work on them. Gunther was shocked to see a barrier around them and called them cowards. However, the trainees simply aimed their magic at Gunther while Sven mockingly asked who was really being underhanded, calling Gunther a bastard. The trainees then launched their combined attack at Gunther. Sven was thrilled that they had managed to land a hit, but Gunther furiously glared at them and called them bastards, threatening that they wouldn't get away with it. This shocked and frightened them. Blake immediately jumped in to protect the trainees, glaring at Gunther. Suddenly, one of the instructors shouted that it was enough and demanded to know what Gunther was doing. Gunther tried to explain that he was just providing guidance, but the instructor sternly told him to stop making excuses. He stated that he knew Gunther held a grudge against Blake and had been harassing Team F. The instructor revealed that he had investigated everything and angrily announced that, as of that day, Gunther was relieved of his duties and should prepare for demotion. Gunther was left speechless, wondering why he had to suffer like this, and blaming it all on Blake. A moment later, they were in the room when Sven remarked that Gunther got what he deserved, which they all agreed with. Therese added that it felt so good to see it, and mentioned that even their starting point for the exercise seemed to have been part of Gunther's harassment. Sven called Gunther a scumbag for holding a grudge against Blake. Blake apologized to them for causing trouble because of him, but Sven immediately told him it wasn't his fault. Therese agreed that they had gotten caught up in it, prompting Sven to tell her not to say things like that. They all gathered around Blake and asked him how he was so strong. Therese told him that he was using barriers unlike anything she had ever seen, and Clara said she was interested. He was about to reply when there was a knock on the door. A lady opened it and informed him that, by order of Lady Edda, the Witch of Wisdom, they had come to escort him. Confused, he pointed at himself, but the lady grabbed him and dragged him out of the room, saying they should depart at once. Therese asked if she meant Edda, the hero's party member, while Clara wondered aloud who Blake really was. A moment later, they arrived at the Hendria Kingdom, specifically at the Magic Research Institute. The Witch of Wisdom and director of the institute, 13-year-old Edda, greeted him and said it had been a while. He greeted her back, telling her he was glad to see that she was doing well. He was about to pat her head when the lady stopped him, stuttering as she reminded him that Edda was a once-in-a-generation genius magician, and treating her like a child was extremely disrespectful. He apologized to Edda and asked if she didn't like it, but Edda replied that it was fine and she didn't mind. Edda quickly moved to the point, explaining that the reason she called him there was to borrow his power to capture monsters. She explained that capturing monsters was difficult. Physical cages didn't work because the monsters would just rampage. Furthermore, while it varied by individual, monsters emitted miasma, which limited research to on-site studies. Even then, those studies had their limits. Eda added that if they could capture and examine monsters at the research institute, they could investigate monster ecology and characteristics, analyze miasma, and potentially develop countermeasures against it. Blake noted that heroes had the goddess's protection, allowing them to completely block miasma. This meant only the hero's party could enter the demon realm with its high miasma concentration. Returning to the original topic, Eda asked Blake if he could capture monsters of level 5 or higher using his barriers. One of the ladies interrupted, saying Eda was overestimating barrier mages and that such a thing wasn't possible. However, Blake simply replied that he thought he could. The lady was shocked and asked him to repeat what he had said. He calmly reiterated that he could capture monsters of level 5 or higher, which made Eda relax and smile. He reasoned that if a salamander was level 4, capturing level 5 monsters should be fine. However, the lady angrily shouted at him, accusing him of making outrageous claims just because Eda was present. She insisted that there was no way he could do it with mere barriers. Blake reassured her that he thought it would be fine, but the lady accused him of lying. Eda intervened, firmly stating that Blake's cooperation had already been decided and she wouldn't tolerate further objections. This frightened the ladies, who immediately apologized. Eda then told Blake not to worry about the Magician Corps because she would submit a request to count his research cooperation as training. Blake acknowledged her plan and thanked her. However, the lady silently speculated that Blake might have some kind of leverage over Eda and decided they needed to protect her, which gave Blake a bad feeling and made him worried. Eda then loudly announced that they were heading to the abandoned Berber mine and instructed everyone to move out immediately. Minutes later, they were all ready. Eda told Blake that it was a stroke of luck to be reunited with her benefactor. She asked him if he had met the others, to which he replied that he had met Alice, and Alice seemed to be doing well. This made Eda laugh as she remarked that Alice was always like that. They laughed together, which irritated the lady, who wondered why Blake seemed to get along so well with Eda when he was just a mere barrier mage. Eda then recounted that if he hadn't saved them in the Forest of Death, they would have undoubtedly lost their lives. Blake recalled that day. He had been hunting in the forest just outside the demon realm, the Forest of Death. By chance, he had found someone alive being attacked by monsters, so he stepped in to save her. When he asked Alice if she was alright, she begged him to help her comrades. He immediately carried Alice and searched the area, eventually finding Eda surrounded by monsters. Eda explained that the Forest of Death bewilders the senses of those who enter, causing them to get separated and wander aimlessly. She added that if he hadn't saved them, they would have died there and thanked him again for his help. Blake whispered to her that he hadn't done anything special, but she laughed and told him he hadn't changed a bit. Suddenly, children ran past them, happily playing. Blake observed them and remarked that they looked like they were having fun. He shared that he had been maintaining barriers alone since he was 9 and envied that kind of carefree life. Eda responded, surprised, that he had been alone all that time. Blake wondered if she had ever played like that, but Eda proudly replied that she was a natural-born genius magician and would never have played with children. Yet, as she peeked at the children, her gaze softened, and she stared at them sadly. A few days later, they arrived at the abandoned Berber mine. They noticed there was more miasma than they had expected. The lady remarked to Eda that it seemed dangerous for anyone except her. Eda then asked Blake if it was possible for him to create a barrier around them and move it. The lady softly doubted it, wondering if such a thing was possible. Blake replied that he could, making the lady shout in disbelief, insisting there was no way it was possible. Without a word, Blake began casting his barrier magic and walked into the dense miasma. The lady shouted that entering such high-density miasma was suicidal, and that this was the result of trying to show off. But Blake turned back and casually asked if they weren't coming, leaving them all stunned that he was still alive. Eda remarked that the effects of Blake's barrier were as they could see and decided they should leave the dragon carriage behind, as it couldn't enter the mine. This further shocked the group. As they entered the mine, they marveled that the barrier truly protected them from such an intense level of miasma, something they had never even heard of before. Despite this, the lady arrogantly claimed that a barrier blocking miasma wasn't that impressive. As they walked deeper into the mine, Blake noted that there were no monsters nearby. Eddie explained that it seemed there was a miasma pool deep inside. Blake surmised that this meant there must be a creature causing the miasma. Eda added that it could also be a cursed object or a natural phenomenon. She elaborated that cursed objects, whether created by humans or naturally occurring in ominous places, generate miasma. Sometimes powerful monsters that produce large amounts of miasma are suddenly born. Miasma creates monsters, which in turn intensify the miasma, resulting in the birth of even more monsters. The Demon King was the ultimate example of this cycle. Eddie explained that, strangely enough, when they defeated the monster that was the source of the miasma, all monsters born from the miasma disappeared. Similarly, when the Demon King was defeated, half of the monsters in the demon realm vanished. However, not all monsters in the world disappeared. Blake smiled as Eda explained. Eda added that, if they could understand the principle behind the creation of miasma and monsters, they might be able to devise countermeasures, making their mission extremely important. Eda didn't see the stone in front of her and accidentally tripped. Fortunately, Blake caught her from behind just in time, making her shy. He then asked if she was okay, but she simply apologized. Blake told her that the uneven ground was hard to see, so it might be dangerous, and asked if she would like him to carry her on his back. The lady immediately pushed him away, shouting at him not to treat Eda like a child, and reminding him that Eda was a genius magician, different from ordinary humans. Eda told them she was fine and that they should keep going. A moment later, they came across a room filled with thick miasma. A monster emerged from hiding, growling loudly when it saw them. They were horrified to discover that it was a level 5 minotaur. Blake told Eda that they should capture it, but the lady walked past him and told him to stand back, claiming they would handle it. The research team magicians began attacking the minotaur with their magic power. But the minotaur merely smiled and roared loudly, deflecting every attack. The lady and the others were shocked by its resilience. Eda shouted that normal magic wouldn't be enough to capture it, as she had suspected, and they needed Blake, the barrier mage. The lady stammered, asking Eda if she truly meant that she could capture the monster, leaving Eda stunned. The team members began urging Eda to handle it herself, declaring that she was the Witch of Wisdom. Under pressure, Eda clenched her teeth and stepped forward, agreeing with her team. She raised her wand and stood in front of the minotaur, determined but visibly tense. Blake watched her with worry as she prepared her magic. The minotaur let out a deafening roar, stunning Eda in place. Noticing her hesitation, Blake saw the minotaur raise its massive axe and swing it at her. Fortunately, a strong barrier appeared, blocking the attack, shocking the lady and the other team members. Blake quickly surrounded the minotaur with his barrier, tightly locking it inside. The lady stammered before shouting at him not to interfere and to stay out of Eda's way. Eda interrupted, shouting for them to stop and reminding them that they had brought Blake specifically to capture the monster. Still fearful, the lady argued that the barrier would surely be destroyed. Eda calmly told them to look at the monster and explained that a refined barrier could block and purify miasma. By sealing the monster within the barrier, they could weaken it. The lady stuttered, admitting she hadn't known barriers had such effects. Eda approached the barrier, astonished to see the level 5 monster rendered completely powerless. She thought it was an incredible feat, knowing her magic couldn't achieve such results. Turning around, Eda thanked Blake for capturing the monster. She then told everyone that they should return immediately. Walking past Blake with a smile, she told him he had saved them, and to keep carrying the monster like that. Blake watched her walk out first, wondering with concern if she had been scared. Days later, Eda praised everyone for doing a great job and announced that they could now begin researching the captured monsters. The team stared at the huge minotaur in front of them. Eda knocked on the barrier holding the minotaur and remarked that barriers were truly convenient, as they could move such a large body with ease. She asked Blake how long he could maintain the barrier, to which he replied that as long as he was nearby, he could maintain it semi-permanently. However, he added that normal barriers lose their effect when the magic supply is cut off. Eda noted that this was problematic and asked if there was a way around it. The lady suggested that it might be better to recapture the monster using Eda's magic power, but Blake pulled out a seal mark and told Eda it should solve the issue. The lady became irritated, asking if there was anything Blake couldn't do. Eda asked him what the seal mark was, and Blake explained that it was a magic circle he had created to maintain the barrier around the demon realm. It could automatically sustain the barrier for a while without constant input of magic power. Eda paused, remembering seeing something similar near the demon realm. She mentioned that she had never heard of such a magic circle and commented that the creator must have been quite remarkable. Blake awkwardly laughed and thanked her, surprising Eda. She asked if he had created it himself, to which he simply replied, yes. He then explained that he believed he was around 9 years old when he developed it. Blake elaborated, saying that 30 years ago, as the demon realm's miasma was eroding the continent, barrier mages were gathered to address the crisis. However, there was nothing prepared for them, and at first they had to maintain the barrier directly. Naturally, this meant they couldn't leave their posts. To solve this, he developed a magic circle that could store magical power. By injecting magic power into it, the barrier could be maintained for extended periods, allowing the mages to take breaks and get food. He added that with 100 people replenishing the magic power, they planned to create a barrier around the entire demon realm. However, in the end, it seemed he was the only one left to carry out the task. As a result, the process required a massive amount of magic power, which was extremely difficult. Everyone was shocked upon hearing his story. Noticing their reactions, Blake asked if something was wrong. Eda excitedly told him that he had accomplished something incredible and asked why he wasn't boasting about it more. He replied that it wasn't really a big deal, then placed both his hands on the magic circle and suggested they set aside that story for now. Blake began casting magic power and asked Eda if they should activate the barrier magic circle. He then cast a barrier around the minotaur, telling her that it should last for a few hours. Just to be safe, he said he would stay nearby during the research. Eda smiled, and told him that was very helpful. Eda announced to everyone that the research could now begin and tasked her team with analyzing the monsters in miasma. They all agreed enthusiastically and quickly got to work. Moments later, the research team was busy while Blake stood guard over the Minotaur. Later that night, everyone else had gone to rest, leaving only Blake and Eda in the lab. The lady excused herself, and Blake noticed that everyone except Eda had gone home. Eda, still busy with her work, told him she had prepared a room for him in the research facility. She suggested he feel free to return there any time and reminded him he only needed to be present when a magic injection was necessary. Blake asked her about herself. She replied that she had to continue advancing the research as quickly as possible to protect the citizens who feared the threat of monsters in miasma. Blake told her he would stay, which prompted Eda to ask if he was being considerate. She added that, if that was the case, it wasn't necessary. Blake replied that he was simply worried the barrier might break, as this was his first time setting up an injection-type barrier outside the demon realm. Eda, unfazed, told him to do as he pleased, to which Blake responded that he would. 1 week later, the team was still researching the monster in miasma. At night, as always, everyone had gone to rest, leaving only Eda and Blake in the lab. The lady excused herself to rest as well. Blake told Eda he was stepping out for a bit, and she simply signed for him to go. He then approached the lady and asked if she had a moment. The lady asked what it was, and Blake explained that he didn't mean to interfere with their policies but was curious why everyone except Eda left early. The lady angrily asked if he was being sarcastic, calling him an outsider, and told him not to meddle. Blake calmly replied that Eda had been researching alone the entire time and asked if they didn't intend to help her. The lady retorted that he didn't understand and explained that Eda was a genius, so there was nothing ordinary people like them could do to assist her. She added that Eda wasn't just a genius in magic but also in research, and no one could keep up with her. While they contributed during work hours, staying beyond that would only hinder Eda. Turning away, the lady told Blake that if he didn't need to stay, he should go home too. She then walked off, leaving him sighing in frustration. Returning to the research room, he found a tired little Eda asleep at her desk. He noticed the dark circles under her eyes and gently placed her coat over her to keep her warm. A few days later, Eda announced that it was lunchtime and told everyone to take a break. The team eagerly rushed out, discussing what they were eating and praising the cafeteria's steak. Left alone, Eda wearily pulled out a piece of bread. Blake told her that she had been cooped up in the lab and suggested she take a proper break too. She replied that she was planning to rest in her room and apologized for always keeping him there. Blake awkwardly laughed and assured her that he was staying because he wanted to. Eda then told him not to worry about her and to take a break himself, to which he reluctantly agreed. Blake headed to the cafeteria, where he saw the team enjoying their meals. One member commented that, as expected of Lady Eda, she continued researching alone, and her dedication was admirable. Others chimed in, proudly stating that they couldn't even compare to her and would only get in the way. They also mentioned that the research level was so high they didn't even understand what Eda was doing and praised her for being able to capture monsters on her own, without issue. The lady confidently told everyone to leave everything to Eda, saying all problems were solved by her genius. She added that Eda was a treasure of the Hendria kingdom, and as long as they followed her, everything would be fine. Blake disagreed, saying he didn't feel the same. The group stood up in anger, demanding to know what he meant. Blake seriously told them that simply praising Eda as a genius and leaving everything to her wasn't what adults should do. Eda was still just a 13-year-old child. The lady shouted at him not to treat Eda like a child, reminding him that she was the greatest genius magician in history, far beyond their level. The others agreed, claiming that while Eda might look like a child, she was a mature adult on the inside and that Blake didn't understand anything. Blake conceded that Eda was incredibly talented in magic and research, likely more capable than most adults. However, he argued that this didn't necessarily mean she was an adult emotionally. He pointed out how Eda had looked enviously at the other children, and how she had been scared during their encounter with the Minotaur. He added that Eda was smart and kind, which was likely why she acted in ways that pleased the adults around her. Walking closer to the lady, Blake asked if they could truly say with certainty that Eda was an adult. He questioned whether they had ever had an honest conversation with her, tried to understand her feelings, or considered helping her. The group fell silent at his words. The lady tried to respond but couldn't come up with anything. Suddenly, one of the men grabbed the lady and told everyone to leave. They all walked away, only to pass a tired-looking Eda, who had been watching them. However, none of them said anything to her. Blake tried to approach Eda to explain, but she turned away and walked off, leaving him worried. Later that night, as Blake sat in his room deep in thought, there was a knock at his door. When he opened it, Eda stood there and asked if she could have a moment with him. Blake gently made Eda sit down on his bed and poured her a cup of hot tea. He handed it to her, and she apologized for the trouble. He simply placed his coat over her shoulders and told her it was cold. She thanked him for the gesture and sipped the tea, softly remarking that it was warm. After finishing her tea, Eda remained silent for a moment before awkwardly apologizing for involving him in her affairs during the day. Blake disagreed, explaining that he was the one who stuck his nose where it didn't belong. He then asked if things had always been like this for her. Etta replied that at first she was full of enthusiasm. However, as she continued working with others, things changed. Gradually they started praising her as a genius witch, and their expectations shifted, making things easier for them. Blake asked if he was right in assuming that her workload increased while others began doing the bare minimum. Etta nodded, saying it had always been like that. She explained that people around her kept changing because of her. She then opened up about her past, telling him she was born to ordinary parents in a small village with no noble or magical lineage in her family. Despite this, she learned language shortly after birth, and, by chance, read through a magic book her parents happened to own. She became fascinated with magic, and her parents noticed. From that day on, they gave her every possible form of magical education, and she became deeply engrossed in it. As a result, everyone started calling her a genius and expecting her to act the part. Etta continued, saying she was forced to act like an adult instead of a child because of the prejudice that geniuses must mature emotionally faster. For magicians, research and combat were considered their true calling. As such, she was made to study both, starting at the tender age of 6. She became desperate, trying to live up to the expectations of her parents and the adults around her. They saw her as a genius, not a child, and she felt compelled to try her hardest. She hesitated, tightly clenching her hands, and Blake gently asked if he was right in guessing that she was afraid of monsters. Etta's eyes widened in surprise, and she asked if he had noticed. Blake explained that he had seen it when he saved her in the past, and again, when they faced the Minotaur, she had looked scared. Shyly, she admitted he was observant and confessed that she was terrified of facing monsters. When she was in the hero's party, she had managed to endure it because the frontliners fought the monsters directly while she only supported them from the back. Her voice trembling, Etta swore to him that she was absolutely terrified of monsters and could never fight them alone. Blake calmly told her he understood, revealing that he, too, was scared of fighting monsters. Surprised, she pointed out that he never seemed afraid. He explained that he had simply suppressed his fear and fought because if he didn't, he wouldn't survive. Over time, the fear became numb. Etta responded sadly, wishing she could have done the same. Blake warmly told her she didn't need to because Etta was fine just as she was. Panicking, Etta screamed that everyone expected her to be strong, they wanted her to be a genius, and someone powerful. Shaking, she held her head and frantically said she had to try her hardest or she would disappoint them. She had to be strong enough to defeat monsters, or else she would be abandoned. Her voice broke as she recalled hearing her parents questioning who would need a daughter who wasn't a genius. She imagined her instructors dismissing her as a worthless disciple without talent. She heard the villagers asking if she wasn't truly a genius after all, and her co-workers shouting that they wouldn't follow an ordinary person. Overwhelmed, Etta clutched her ears in pain, begging the voices not to leave her or abandon her. She vowed to be good, to be a genius, to act like an adult. She pleaded with them not to abandon her. Suddenly, she felt Blake gently pat her head. His voice calm and soothing, he told her, "It's okay." Blake gently swore to Etta that he would never abandon her, and his words calmed her down. He told her that what she had gone through was hard and that she had suffered so much. Then, he softly asked if it had been tough, making her burst into tears. Blake praised her for doing a great job, and upon hearing his warm and sweet words, Etta couldn't hold back any longer. She hugged him tightly, like an ordinary child in pain, and cried out that she wanted to play with friends, eat sweets, take a break from work, and spend more fun time with her family. She confessed that while she loved research, she hated fighting monsters because it was scary and painful. Through her sobs, she asked why she couldn't rely on others. Blake explained that children are allowed to be vulnerable with adults, but Etta shook her head and said that everyone told her that. Because she was a genius, she couldn't show weakness. As the Witch of Wisdom, she was expected to behave like an adult. Blake gently patted her head and reassured her that she didn't need to try so hard. Whenever she was struggling, suffering, or even for no particular reason, she could always rely on him. Etta looked at him and hesitantly asked if it was really okay. Blake smiled warmly and assured her that it was. When she asked again, needing confirmation, he firmly replied that he meant it. Etta hugged him tightly, feeling a warmth she hadn't experienced in a long time. She rested her head on his lap, finally letting herself relax. She thanked him softly while he held her hand and gently patted her head, calming her further. Blake smiled as he saw her, now calm and vulnerable, acting like the child she truly was. As he gazed outside, Blake's thoughts drifted back to the day he had saved Etta from a swarm of monsters. After defeating them, he rushed to her side, finding her collapsed in fear. Later, as Etta and Alice rested, he prepared to step away to reinforce the barrier when he heard Etta crying in her sleep. Her trembling hand reached out, as though searching for someone. In that moment, Blake saw a pitiful child who just wanted to be accepted. He held her hand, and just like now, she calmed down and relaxed at his touch. Even in her sleep, Etta begged him not to go and not to leave her all alone. Blake had gently replied that he was right there and wasn't going anywhere. A few days later, Blake was strolling down the street in casual clothes. As he waited, a child approached him, her voice cheerful as she asked if she had kept him waiting. Blake smiled warmly as he saw Eda dressed like a child, free from the burdens of her title and expectations. Several days ago, Eda encouraged her team, saying they should work hard together that day as well. They stutteringly replied with a hesitant yes and agreed to do their best. They began their tasks while Eda focused on hers, unaware of their awkward glances in her direction, something Blake noticed. At night, as usual, everyone took their leave, leaving Eda alone in the research room. The next day, the same routine repeated. Eda led the team as usual, and the day after that, nothing changed. Everyone continued to act the same. On the fourth day, while Eda was reading a book, she realized she couldn't focus or understand anything. Frustrated, she shut the book and walked toward Blake. Without warning, she hugged him tightly and shouted that she couldn't take it anymore. She confessed she was exhausted and didn't want to do anything else. Blake softly patted her head and told her it must have been tough. Eda, comforted by his warmth, happily asked him to pat her more and give her a big hug, which he gladly did. Noticing her stress, Blake wished he could do something for her. He asked if she had a day off the following day and whether there was anything she'd like to do. Eda replied that she wanted to go out with him. The next day, they met at the street market. Eda asked if she had kept him waiting, but Blake smiled and assured her he hadn't waited at all. He then asked if they should get going. As they strolled through the bustling market, both were amazed by the variety of stalls and the lively crowd. Blake asked if it was her first time visiting the market street, and Eda admitted that it was. She explained that since coming to the royal capital, she hadn't gone out much and had never played in the city before. Blake smiled and told her it was wonderful, confusing her. Taking her hand, he softly dragged her along, saying that exploring something for the first time was always more fun. Eda's excitement grew, and she wholeheartedly agreed. They explored the market together, sampling sweets and enjoying themselves. At one point, Eda noticed a group of children chasing each other and playing. Blake encouraged her to join them. Watching her play happily like a normal child made him smile. As night fell, the market stalls began to close, and it was time for Eda to say goodbye to her new friends. She smiled warmly at Blake and thanked him for the day. On their way back to the Magic Research Institute, Eda stopped to admire some shiny jewelry at a nearby stall. Blake noticed her gaze and asked if she had found something she liked, which made her flustered. She hesitated but began looking at the jewelry. Blake picked up a necklace with a shining blue pendant that she had been staring at and told the seller he would take it. Eda panicked, insisting she would pay for it herself, but Blake smiled and told her it was a gift. Stunned, Eda watched as he paid for the necklace. The seller handed it to Eda, and she proudly raised the necklace, thanking Blake with a big smile. She hugged the gift adorably, making the seller laugh and comment that Blake was a kind father with an adorable daughter. Both Blake and Eda froze in surprise before laughing together without correcting the misunderstanding. They returned to the institute, both in high spirits. 1 week later, the team gathered in the research room. Eda shyly apologized to everyone, admitting that she hadn't been able to figure out how to counter the miasma. However, she shared that she had come to reappreciate the usefulness of barrier techniques, especially for completely blocking and purifying miasma. She announced her plan to gather more barrier mages and advance their research on barriers. Turning to Blake, she asked if he would cooperate with them again. He smiled and replied with a confident yes. Before the conversation could continue, the lady interrupted, surprising both Eda and Blake. The entire team suddenly bowed deeply and sincerely apologized in unison. The lady confessed that, due to their inferiority complex, they had completely relied on Eda, shifting all responsibility onto her because she was a genius. Worse, they had neglected their efforts and grown complacent. She also admitted that, out of jealousy, they had behaved disrespectfully toward Blake, looking down on barrier mages to protect their own pride. They bowed again, apologizing to both Eda and Blake. Eda reassured them that it was all right and that she didn't mind. Blake agreed, saying he felt the same as Eda. Eda then placed her hand on the lady's shoulder, gently reminding her that relying on her entirely was troublesome. She encouraged them to put in more effort and work hard from now on. The lady, touched by Eda's words, thanked her for her kindness. The other members surrounded Blake to apologize as well. They admitted that the incident had made them understand the greatness of barrier techniques, recognizing them as truly amazing magic. While the group happily chatted with Blake, Eda quietly asked the lady why they had decided to apologize. The lady explained that it was thanks to Blake. She admitted that they had always noticed Eda wasn't feeling well and knew they were partly responsible for it. However, they lacked the courage to face their own helplessness. The lady added that Blake had scolded them, helped Eda, and made her cheerful again, which gave them the courage to take a step forward. She concluded by saying both Blake and his barrier techniques were truly wonderful. Eda immediately agreed, smiling as she told the lady from the bottom of her heart, "Blake really is wonderful." The next day, the members of the research team and Eda escorted Blake outside. Eda told him she would let him know if there was any progress, to which he replied that he would be waiting. Then, calling him closer, she whispered if he would indulge her again. He smiled and assured her he would do so any time, making her smile while her team looked on in confusion. Blake waved goodbye and walked away, realizing he hadn't been back to the dormitory in a while and wondering how everyone was doing. Later, back at the dormitory, Therese shouted at him for being late coming home. Clara glared at him, and Sven shouted that he had been worried. Panicking at their reactions, Blake began explaining what had happened while he was away. Sven exclaimed in disbelief, saying they all knew only a select few could enter the Magic Research Institute, and being close to 2 members of the heroes' party seemed impossible. They wondered aloud if barrier magic was truly that incredible and began questioning who Blake really was. Blake asked how things had been while he was gone. Sven grinned, saying he had been waiting for that question. Proudly, he announced that he would show Blake the results of his training the next day. The next day at the training grounds, Therese, Clara, and Sven poured their magic power into their attacks, striking the training targets while Blake silently observed, though he couldn't help but feel worried. Sven cursed in frustration, shouting that he should be able to do better. Therese told him that getting stronger wasn't something that happened overnight. Another team passed by, mocking them as dropouts. They teased that they had barely passed before, and their recent success in the exercise must have been a fluke. Sven furiously shouted back, telling them to say whatever they wanted. Therese admitted that it couldn't be helped, as they really were dropouts. Clara agreed, adding that they had always been in last place. Sven, growing angrier, demanded to know if they were giving up and planning to rely on the old man again without doing anything themselves. Therese shouted that she didn't say that, but Sven turned and stormed off, saying he'd had enough and wouldn't give up. Therese whispered, wondering what was wrong with Sven, and Clara expressed concern. Blake quietly observed the situation. A moment later, Blake found Sven kneeling in front of him with his head down. Sven begged Blake to teach him magic, saying he needed to get stronger or he would be fired. Blake asked why Sven was going to such lengths, and Sven explained that he was the eldest son of a rural noble family and the only magician in their lineage. Because of this, he was expected to succeed. However, they were poor country nobles who couldn't live luxuriously. Sven wanted to earn money to improve his family's life. Blake told him he understood but reminded him that he only knew barrier techniques. Sven responded that he understood and was disappointed. Blake then offered to teach him combat techniques instead, which made Sven overjoyed. Sven begged Blake to start immediately, and Blake suggested beginning the next day. Sven excitedly thanked him over and over. The following day, Sven was irritated to see Therese and Clara there as well. Therese teased him, saying he couldn't get ahead of them so easily. Clara added that it wasn't fair to rely on the old man alone. Blake explained that he had invited them because they seemed to feel the same way as Sven. Sven reluctantly admitted it might be true but complained that he had gone through the trouble of begging first. Blake apologized for that. Clara, standing behind Blake, thought to herself that she might discover the secret to his strength. Until now, she had only been casually observing him, but today, she planned to pay closer attention. Blake suddenly looked back at her and smiled, surprising Clara. Embarrassed, she quickly turned away and reminded herself to be more discreet. A moment later, they arrived at Mecha Forest. Sven was attacking a lizard with fire magic, giving his all to defeat it. When he successfully killed it, he proudly exclaimed that he could do it too. Suddenly, he heard a noise behind him and turned, only to find another lizard lunging at him with its mouth wide open. Before he could react, a sharp barrier swung around and sliced the lizard into pieces. Blake reminded Sven not to let his guard down, and Sven apologized. They shouted that the monsters were multiplying. Blake calmly walked forward and told them he would demonstrate. Forming a barrier sword, he explained that when faced with many enemies, wide-range magic was best. With a single swing, he effortlessly decapitated the surrounding lizards. Therese, stunned, asked if he wasn't a bit too strong. Clara asked why he was so powerful, and Sven questioned how he could do this if he was just a barrier mage maintaining the demon realm's defenses. Blake was surprised by their reactions and smiled, telling them it was an old story that would take a while to explain. After their training, they sat in a safe spot. Blake began recounting his story, saying it all started 30 years ago when he was just 9 years old.